So I want to talk about this bizarre alternative history that's being written on Wikipedia. It goes by the name World War I, and at first it was called the Great War, but then they decided to have a sequel, so they changed the name from the Great War to World War I. And it's kind of like the Blair Witch Project in that it's all written in this sort of documentary style, but you'd have to be like a, IQ under 80 to not recognize that this is fiction. So first, the countries here, it looks like some sort of Reddit power fantasy. It breaks immersion. Like the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Okay, this is something they just slapped together, this made-up country. The writers cooked up so that they can make the war even, because the factions have to be even, and we'll get into that. And they did the same thing with this other country over here. They called it the Ottoman Empire. I'm not making this up. They called it the thing you put your feet on. Yeah, the Ottoman Empire. It's another one of these like bogus, cobbled together countries. And they use it for some desert fight scenes. And also this one ridiculous scene called the Battle of Gallipoli? Gallipoli? Gallop something. And it's this totally contrived scenario where the English, which in the show are called the British Empire, that's a whole nother ball of wax. So they're attacking this little strait with a bunch of big forts lining the strait, and they're duking it out with these big steamships. It's really steampunk. And according to the show, if the British take this strait, that will knock out the Ottoman Empire out of the war. And of course, for this episode, they brought a whole bunch of Australian guys for flavor, right? And they were fighting Turkish, that's what they call them, Turkish guys with a bunch of fezzes over some strait with the big forts with guns and steamships with these ridiculous oversized guns. And the generals, they were also just retarded, right? They'd order men to charge over open ground, getting shot at by machine guns. And it was so, it was retarded. Like, any general who did that would be immediately court-martialed. And it's also, I mean, maybe somebody could slip through the cracks, but almost nobody who becomes a general would ever order something like that. You couldn't be that kind of person and become general. But they did that. They made the leadership really stupid in order to create drama. And I think that's sort of supposed to be like the reason it didn't work. Because if it did work, that would knock out the Ottoman Empire, and they wanted to have more the Ottoman Empire, and they wanted to have more desert fight scenes. They wanted to keep the war going because their series wasn't done. It's completely contrived, and one thing that writers need to understand when writing this kind of stuff, especially if you're writing it in a documentary style like they do on Wikipedia, it has to be immersive. And the Battle of the Gallop Strait or whatever, it's just not immersive. It's just not realistic that would actually happen. And the Turks, as they call them, they're ridiculous. They're basically just white guys with Arab, sort of swarthy looking white guys with Arab looking clothes and fezzes. They look kind of like Greeks, but yeah, they're just a faction of swarthy but still white guys with like these Middle Eastern get-ups. I don't understand what the point of that is. Oh, and within the Ottoman Empire, I'll never get over that Ottoman. Within the Ottoman Empire, the part of the empire the Turks are called, it's called Turkey. And Turkey is right next to Greece, and they hate each other. I mean, like, look, if you don't believe that writers could be so hackneyed as to write this kind of stuff, I guess they think that's funny or something. But no, they're at war with Turkey, and Turkey and Greece are regularly involved with conflicts involving the Austro-Hungary Empire. That's funny, right? Like, no, I don't know. Why don't you have like a faction called Chile or something, or Djibouti, have a country called Djibouti and make Djibouti a black country, right? Because black people are into Djibouti. Oh, and that might be too much for them. That might be a little racist to call a black country Djibouti, or make a black country called Niger. Or Nigeria, or make a country called Chad and make it into the face of that Chad face in the Virgin versus Chad memes. You know what I'm talking about? And make Chad this big country, right? And have a country called the Virgin Islands, and they're like these pathetic little islands in the middle of the ocean all alone, while Chad is like surrounded by Djibouti or something. Anyway, I'm getting off track. Let's get back to the Great War that was retconned as World War One season. And that's right, this is just the first one. They have another one. It's called World War II, which that is a whole nother howler of a season. So you have this like Reddit alternative history vomit as a map for the story. And how does the war start? Now you'd think something smart, like this country over here called Russia builds up their military and makes a deal with other countries to carve up the middle countries here, right? Germany and Austria-Hungary, right? That would make sense, right? And then they would spring a trap and just steamroll Germany and Austria-Hungary, right? But no, that would be too high Q, and that would make too much sense for these writers. Instead, what happens is that the Serbians, this little country down here, they send someone to assassinate some king or some duke or some prince or something in Austria-Hungary. And why do they do this? Who the hell knows? And of course, this guy gets killed in a city called Sarajevo. And Sarajevo is full of Turks. But they're not really Turks in this, the writers. They're actually Bosniaks or something. But they're more of these white guys with the Middle Eastern get-ups, right? They're basically Turks, but they're called something different. So they really seem to push this whole white guys in Middle Eastern aesthetic for some reason as being like central to this whole war. But apparently they kind of dropped this idea later, because later episodes they're more focused on sort of more European aesthetic factions. I don't know why they did that, but they sort of shifted to that. So anyway, this duke or whatever is killed in Sarajevo, and this makes Austria-Hungary mad, and so they demand Serbia basically be annexed by Austria-Hungary. All over this one little duke, mind you. Now, Serbia says no, so Austria-Hungary invades Serbia. But to make it balanced, right, because you look at the map, it looks like Austria-Hungary would steamroll Serbia in all of 5 minutes. But to make it balanced, what the writers do is to make the Austro-Hungarians declare war before they were ready. So the Serbs, at the start, what they did is they took some land from Austria-Hungary that was actually an artillery practice range that the Austro-Hungarians set up before the war, which was basically a huge field of fire zone with all sorts of pre-sighted target points. And once the Austro-Hungarians finally got organized and attacked Serbia, the first place they attacked was actually a place that within Austria-Hungary that the Serbians took, and so they attacked across their own artillery range and just got shot to pieces. Like why wouldn't the Austro-Hungarians just wait until they were ready to declare war? And like, why would they have an artillery range on the border near Serbia that the Serbs could just take, like in the opening days of the war? Like, none of this makes any sense from like a military planning standpoint. But the writers wanted to do this just so we could like feel something for the plucky little Serbs. It's just so contrived. But they try to make Austria-Hungary and Germany the villains, but if you're gonna do that, you gotta make your villains competent. Otherwise, there's no tension, and it's just a joke. Right? That's something that they learned when doing World War II. Much better villain in that one. So the Austrians, and I'm just gonna call them Austrians now, they're attacking Serbia. But then Russia, this big menacing country over here, they decide to attack Austria to protect Serbia. Why? Because reasons, because plot, because they want to have a big war, right? So they have to do all this stuff, you know, this roundabout thing. They could do something smart. They had to make it centered on the Duke of Sarajevo or something, right? And so they had all these countries fighting over that, basically, because plot. And so they need to go to war and have a big old war over some duke. And then, to protect Austria, Germany declares war on Russia. Now, the main factions that the character is supposed to, that the audience is supposed to identify with, this is France and Britain, and later on the United States. I think that's because this was originally going to be like a European show, but that they found that people in America were interested later on. So I think they sort of brought the US in to sort of bring on, you know, because they saw they had a lot of US fans of this show. But they didn't have them at the start of the war. But anyway, but at the beginning, France and Britain, they're supposed to be the good guys who the audience is supposed to identify with. So France starts mobilizing. Oh, that's right, mobilizing. All these little countries, instead of having like actual professional armies, they have some like Starship Troopers thing where they just round up a bunch of random people, give them some very rudimentary training, hand them a rifle, and then just send them off to war. I mean, that seems like a horribly inefficient way to have an army. Because, you know, you're going to cripple all your home industries by sending all of your fighting age men off to war or whatever. But whatever. I guess they want the audience to identify with the soldiers as being an average Joe just like me. So they made up this ridiculous mobilization thing that all the countries are doing. Anyway, so France is mobilizing. And Germany says to France, hey, stop mobilizing or we'll invade you. Like, why? Why would you do that? You would start a war because France is mobilizing in response to you mobilizing. And as stupid as all this is up to this point, okay, so France refuses to demobilize. But then Germany, instead of just invading France, because that's who they're at war with, because supposedly the terrain direct into France is too hilly or something, whatever, plot, fine. They can't invade France straight in, so they invade this little country called Belgium in their mad drive to get to invade France, even though they're already at war with Russia. And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, like, is this some sort of gag? Like, you're putting me on. Do they have any editors or anyone to say, you know, why don't we make our villain not a clown? Oh, and this is the main villain, Kaiser Wilhelm, who they wrote as being just super incompetent. Also, there was this other leader, Bismarck, who was this amazing, supposedly, they wrote him as being like this amazing politician in general, kind of like Thrawn or something, who single-handedly unified Germany just like 30 years before or something, maybe it was 40 years. But that's part of the expanded universe. I don't know if that's canon, but that's the whole Bismarck backstory. But it's just kind of ridiculous how everything he does in like the Bismarck saga just works, and how after winning these he wins like a skirmish against Austria and then France, and because of that the whole of Germany just magically decides to join Bismarck's faction. It's never explained why, they just do because plot, you know, like how are they going to have the Great War if Germany doesn't exist? So they have to have this ham-fisted way that Germany comes into existence, and it comes into existence because Bismarck beats Austria-Hungary and then France in some wars, and then the whole rest of Germany decides to join Bismarck. Bismarck's faction before taking over Germany is called Prussia, and it's right next to Russia. Okay, sure. Fine. In fact, at one point, Bismarck is offered the crown as king of Germany from some uprising somewhere, but then he refuses it because he says, I don't want a crown from the gutter. And he literally gives up being the king of Germany in like 1850, like 20 years before it happened in the story, because he doesn't want to be crowned king by a revolutionary movement or something. And like, I get that, you know, you want to make, they're really trying to put forth Bismarck as this really sort of stern Prussian sort of character or whatever, but this is just unrealistic. Like, nobody would do that. Nobody would give up. Like, when the power that your life's work is directed towards, the unification of Germany, is just handed to you right there, you're not going to give it up just because, you know, it came from a revolution, or, you know, and you say it's a crown from the gutter. That's retarded. Nobody would do that. But anyway, Bismarck saga is just expanded universe backstory. I don't know if it's even canon, so I shouldn't really rag on it too much. So back to the clown Kaiser Wilhelm. He fired Bismarck. Right? Of course he did. And then Wilhelm started making all these stupid decisions, which, you know, of course, because they want the villains to be clowns. Like, why? But okay. And so Germany invades Belgium because they want to get to France, even though they have a border with France, but they can't attack France directly because plot. You know, the writers wrote it, oh, it's really hilly there or something. Okay, that's like there's a plot reason why they had to do that. But what the writers really wanted is they wanted to bring Great Britain into the war. Because Britain and France, according to this, they had always been rivals before that, so they had fought like really long wars before this, but now they're teaming up to face this new Germany that magically formed because Bismarck won a few battles outside of Germany, and because of that, the rest of Germany just magically joined together. So they invent this new enemy, Germany, that just came kind of out of nowhere to make these longtime rivals now team up and take down the big bad. It's that sort of angle of the longtime enemies now teaming up to fight a greater evil. And it's the German invasion of Belgium, this totally contrived decision by Clown King Kaiser Wilhelm, that brings the British Empire into the war. Like, I know I'm using the word contrived a lot, but it really is. Like, how else can you describe this? So the Germans advance really far into France. They're just steamrolling through. And it looks like they're going to break through and take Paris, but you know that's not going to happen, right? It's sort of this artificial tension. Now, in this sequel, in World War II, that's a different story. The writers took more risks with that. It's a little bit darker. But here, you basically know the good guys aren't going to lose, right? France is not going to lose Paris, and it looks like they are, but at the last minute, the British Expeditionary Force arrives just in time to save Paris at the Battle of the Somme River. And it's this false suspense you see in movies where the bad guy is just about to win, but then out of nowhere, the cavalry comes in to save the day. And apparently they had to use taxis from Paris to get to the battlefield, so it's all like this fuzzy, we're all in this together, working with the citizens of Paris to take taxis to get troops to the battle to win at the Somme, Why is the Somme so important? Because it was made important by the plot or whatever. And of course, the Clown King Kaiser Wilhelm, he calls this British force that comes in and saves the day at like literally the last minute. He calls this a contemptible little army, right? It's this cliche, snobby, and overconfident villain that they're trying to paint here. And of course, from then on, the British call themselves the Old Contemptibles. And it's like, it's cute or whatever, but no serious politician would do that, because it's like Hillary Clinton calling the Trump people the deplorables, right? They just owned the label and it became sort of ironic. That's what calling them contemptible would do. It's just lazy writing. Like who are these idiots? How would these kinds of people become the kings of countries and then lead tens of millions of people into a war this stupid? Now, I haven't talked about the aesthetics of the film very much, and on that, I gotta say they did a pretty good job. Think steampunk, but like really gritty, There's some stuff in there that's, viewer discretion. Like it could get really, really graphic. Now, most of the series is focused on the war between Germany and France and Britain, but about half or more of the fighting, according to like the broader canon of the series, is actually going on in Russia. Although most of the focus is on the war in what is called the West, because the audience is supposed to identify with France and Britain. But according to the storyline, about half or more is actually going on in Russia. And they call it the Eastern and Western Front. Now, Russia, they're this huge country over here that you think would be really powerful and just steamroll, their opponents. But, right, the writers, of course, they want to drag this war out, and so for balance purposes, they made Russia have like really poor industry, and they gave them low national unity and all these negative leadership modifiers to make it interesting and really tense, right? Because you don't want Russia to come in and just steamroll everyone. The Russians would be like the Skaven or the Orcs in Warhammer. Lots of units, really cheap to produce, not very good quality. And I'm fine with that, to have a faction like that. It's kind of made up, but look, you gotta have balance and tension in your story, so fine, whatever. So the war is going on, and the writers, they really milk it. And in order to do this, they have it be trench warfare, where neither army can really advance. And that's convenient, because I don't know how many episodes of this they made. I just sort of read the Wikipedia overview. Maybe they had to make like 20 episodes or whatever. So they really need the fighting to drag out. And they invented this kind of warfare called trench warfare to really drag the fighting out. Now, there's these other countries, Italy, and as we've seen before, the Ottoman Empire. I'll never get over that stupid name. So these countries, they're on the sidelines. And I think the writers are testing the waters here, gauging audience reaction to decide which side they'll come in on. I think originally they wanted Italy to join with Germany and Austria-Hungary. On Italy. Italy is basically like the Mario country. Everyone looks and talks like Mario, or, you know, like those guys from West Side Story or the Mafia, or sort of like greaser culture, which isn't horrible, but it's kind of unrealistic, like, that people like that would be able to run a functioning country. But at least, like, so the writers do that. They have a country made up entirely of people like this, which, like, as we all know, a country like that would be ridiculously corrupt and would be, like, behind the rest of Europe, like, permanently. But at least the writers, they had a sense of humor, because Italy, in their little narrative, in the Great War series, Italy is barely functioning, and also, like, they're really bad at fighting. So I guess they decide to have Italians, because they're so goofy, to join the good guys. But they're so bad that Austria, who's currently fighting in the Balkans against Serbia and Romania, and also against Russia, that the Austrians, with like a skeleton force, are able to stop the Italians cold. I mean, I've lost all immersion from all the stupid plot anyway, so yeah, West Side Story, Mafia, Mario guys have their own country called Italy, which is located in the former Roman Empire, but they're really bad at war. Right? And someone got paid to write this, by the way. I guess that's funny, right? Put them right where the former Roman Empire used to be, but have them like be really bad at war, and have them be like some sort of Mario Mafia West Side Story stereotype people. I mean, like, professional writers making a living wrote this. I don't know how they got away with writing this, with writing what they wrote about Italy during the Great War, World War I. Same with the Ottomans. They're like sort of the swarthy white guys who basically look like Southern Italians, who dress Middle Eastern, but they're they're better at fighting than the Italians, and they're actually able to beat the British at first, and they're able to beat the British at several battles all throughout the season, which I think it's because the Ottomans are the bad guys, so you gotta create tension with them, so they have to be somewhat competent, whereas having the Italians introduced and be sort of incompetent, that's fine, because they're not really needed into the plot, and they're sort of incidental to, like, the ultimate conclusion to the war anyway, and so for dramatic purposes, you don't really need to introduce the Italians. I think they're more like comic relief. So, but with the Ottomans, they're one of the bad guy factions, so you gotta create tension. And they also want to have all these desert battles, and the desert battles have to be tense and exciting, so the Ottomans have to be competent. And really, I think that's why they just brought the Ottomans in, so they could have a bunch of scenes in the Middle East, sort of the exotic locales to have the battles. And then they do that Gallop battle or whatever, which is, I gotta admit, it's a fantastic visual. Right? Really, really steampunk. I know I'm using that term a lot, but story-wise, the Battle of Gallipini or whatever is completely cockneyed. Sending a bunch of ships into like this narrow channel with like forts with guns lining the sides, having guys hit the beaches that are defended by machine gun nests. I mean, it's just retarded. Like, no idiot would do that, and nobody would be so stupid to think that winning there would knock the Ottomans out of the war, or whatever the hell Churchill thought, according to the plot. Now, in the middle of the series, they decide to spice things up a bit, so they introduce air war. Now, in this air war, they have the Germans using basically blimps. Now, these things are so stupid. They're filled with explosive hydrogen gas, right? Hydrogen gas is explosive, so their weapon of war, they have a weapon of war whose means of travel depends on being connected to basically a bomb 10 times the volume of whatever it's carrying. Okay, fine, whatever. The writers, I guess they put them in because they look menacing. They're like these big, slow-moving things in the sky. Like, rawr, we're the evil Germans or whatever. And what did the Germans do with these blimps? They bombed London, right? Just the city, the people, right? They flew to London and just dropped bombs from the blimps. Just to be horrible, right? I guess because they're like the bad guys or whatever. Like with the Death Star in Star Wars, like that could destroy planets and that could be used to keep systems in line to intimidate. It's horrible, but there's sort of a logic behind the Death Star. But this is like, we're just gonna bomb random people because we're mean. Also, they have these helmets with like these stupid spikes on top, which, like, from a military standpoint, are retarded because, like, they're in the trenches, and so you can easily see where the troops are because these stupid spikes point out over the trench. I think they removed it in the later episodes because the audience were calling out just how stupid those little spikes on the helmets were. But, like, early on, they had the Germans wearing these little spike-topped helmets, which just looked... they just look so stupid, and of course they made him an easy target, right? So I think they removed him because it was just like as dumb as a lot of the stuff in the series is. That was just that was too stupid, and the writers got the memo. So I give them some credit for responding to criticism on that, at least. But eventually, back to the blimps, the British managed to take them down with planes that could fly just high enough to reach the blimps, because apparently the blimps were able to avoid the heavier than air airplanes because they could fly higher. Sure, they had to have some reason to use the blimps, so they made up this thing that, oh, they could fly higher. The fixed wing aircraft couldn't reach them. All right, whatever. But then later on, the Germans have their own airplanes. Now, the technology of the time, because again, this is sort of like a steampunk thing, and so it runs the range from like the Middle Ages to mid-industrial. It's really anachronistic. They have like horses and donkeys pulling stuff, but at the same time they have steam trains, and now they have airplanes. So the technology spectrum, like, it's not consistent. Like, it's all over the place. You know, they have scenes in Russia where it looks like the fighting is straight from like the Middle Ages, and then they have fighting like the air war over London, which looks, you know, almost like pre-modern. The planes they use, they're like really janky. And I kind of like it. I kind of like that they didn't make them too sleek. They made them like sort of really janky looking things. And these rink-a-dink plywood and fabric things with basically lawnmower engines attached to it. They're really goofy looking. And I don't think any of these would actually fly. They don't look like they would actually fly. But I kind of like the aesthetic. So whatever, I'll give them a pass on that. But then the writers made up this character called the Red Baron, who flies not a biplane, and it's painted all red, so you can see it from a mile away, right? Well, but why would you want to do that? Why would you want to have a biplane when you can have a triplane? Like, what's better than 2 wings? 3 wings! I mean, if this show was like that movie 300, which was sort of kind of like a surreal, impressionistic sort of fighting. It wasn't meant to be realistic. It was sort of like almost like a dreamlike movie. That would be fine. But this is like something out of Yellow Submarine. Like, the writers take great pains to make the show seem like almost like a documentary, right? It's the whole documentary style where they try to get the audience really immersed in what's going on. But then they just randomly pull out this goofy crap like the Red Baron, an airplane that's painted all red so you could see it from really far away. And what's better than 2 wings? 3 wings. Why would you do that? This plane... would this even fly? 2 wings are cool, but what if we had 3? Why has nobody thought of this? Imagine when somebody discovers 4 wings. Oh, then we'd really be in trouble if we did that. Now, in the series, the Red Baron arc, it kind of drags on for too long. And so the Red Baron is never shot down by another fighter. But the story was getting old, so they wanted to move on. So they had the Red Baron get shot down by ground fire, which I think from the writer's perspective made sense, because that ends the whole Red Baron side story, which was getting stale, but it preserves his mystique. He was never defeated in air-to-air combat. Okay, fair enough. Now, toward the end of the series, the writers kind of painted themselves into the corner because they have all these stalemates everywhere. And they want Germany to appear really fearsome, but they also have to lose. The way this ends, it's just the most Deus Ex Machina stuff that I've ever seen. Go read it if you think I'm making this up. To create tension, they have to get rid of Russia, right? Because what they want to do is they get rid of Russia, and then the Germans can put all their troops into France, and now that sort of creates an explanation for why the situation in France, after having been a stalemate for so long, is now in jeopardy. Because now the Germans have all these troops that were originally in Russia, now they're charging into France, right? So how do they do that? How do they knock out Russia? Well, in the most contrived way imaginable. So they have a guy in Switzerland, right? It's a little mountain country that managed to stay out of the war, like a stereotypical mountain foresty cabin land. Fine, whatever. I have no problem with this Switzerland place. Now, like, why does such a place even exist? Isn't Austria like right next to it and basically the same kind of mountain sort of? Whatever. Switzerland, fine. So this guy Lenin is what is called a communist. And communist is basically just take stuff from rich people and give to the poor people. It's the most simplistic stereotype of, you know, what we think of as a leftist that I've ever seen. Complete with the hipster aesthetic and pseudo-intellectualism and philosophizing. The whole shebang. It's like just over-the-top Starbucksing, all right? The Germans, they have an idea. They'll send Lenin to Russia, and he'll start a revolution and a civil war in Russia, and Russia will leave the war. Now, think about these writers. These writers are, I mean, they're basically saying, yeah, we'll introduce like these kinds of, you know, sort of hipster people, and they're a cancer that will undermine our enemy. Like, kind of, I mean, these writers, they're kind of red-pilled, I have to say, on this stuff. Anyway, but as red-pilled as it may be, it's really dumb. Because one guy, right, one guy who we're just being introduced to is going to do all this. And the Germans, they're strangely confident that it's going to happen, and that they just act like, oh, of course, when we do this, Russia will no longer be in the war, because they will be fighting a civil war. And I'm just like, there's 10,000 raging shitlibs at any given moment on like every street corner in San Francisco, and nothing like this happens. But in this universe, one guy doing that's gonna set off a revolution? Okay, but whatever. They need this to happen because plot. They need to create tension, so they're moving this to the final showdown. So Russia is now effectively out of the war. There's a civil war between the communists. And the Germans, they start sending all these guys from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. So now Germany has almost all the guys that were in the Eastern Front. They're now in the West, and they have these series of attacks in the West in France. And they start advancing, and the front's in chaos, and people are panicking. Just sort of like they did at the beginning of the war. They're reintroducing the kind of dread that existed at the beginning of the war, that, oh my god, the Germans are going to win. They're breaking through in the offensives of 1918 or whatever. Which, of course, begs the question, why didn't Germany send Lenin to Russia at the beginning of the war? Whatever. Plot, I'm not even going to go there. So the Germans, they're advancing again, and they're getting really close to Paris. And it's like, oh no, the Germans are going to take Paris. The Empire strikes back, right? And all throughout, I talked about the little pointy thing, the pointy on the helmet, but aside from that being kind of stupid, their helmets, they're obviously derivatives of like the Star Wars Vader helmet, I think. Now, I may be reading too much into this, but the whole aesthetic of the Germans seems to mimic the Empire of Star Wars, just taking that and putting it into a different sort of technological setting. But they're basically the Empire from Star Wars. But then, here's what also makes me think that the writers of the Great War are really copying Star Wars. In sort of towards the end of this, and the big attacks at the end, where the Germans, they're about to win, the Germans attack with specially trained soldiers that they call stormtroopers. So now I basically don't think we can deny that World War I or the Great War is rather brazenly ripping off the Empire from Star Wars. So this, of course, begs another question. Why didn't the Germans train and use stormtroopers from the beginning? Whatever, plot. So France and Britain, they're on the ropes. They're about to be knocked out. These offensives of 1918, they're closer to Paris than they'd been since the Battle of the Somme. And the ending has to be... like, as ridiculous as knocking out Russia was, this is probably about as ridiculous. Is more Deus Ex Machina garbage I've seen. Apparently, it involves basically the US comes in and saves the day. But how does the US get into the war? Well, the German Navy has been sinking merchant ships in the Atlantic. Not going in a straight fight against other enemy warships, but using submarines to sink merchant shipping. So like villain stuff, right? Because the Germans are the villains, right? So they have to sink not military vessels, but vessels carrying food and medicine. But the Germans, they sunk a ship that had civilians on it called the Lusitania, and American civilians, of course. Now, why were American civilians sailing into a war zone? That's like retarded. Like, why would you do that? Why would you be so stupid as to board a ship to sail into like waters where like warships are shooting at each other all the time? Like, that's, again, that sort of breaks immersion, because like in the real world, like whenever there's a conflict, countries are actively trying to take their citizens out of the conflict zone. Here, they're just saying, yeah, go right on in, you know? Yeah, there's ships shooting each other all the time over there in those waters, but hey, whatever. You know, we have an agreement that they won't shoot you or something. It's so dumb. But whatever, they do that. So they sink the Lusitania, and that's enough to bring the United States into the war. Whatever, this whole thing started with like the Duke of Sarajevo getting killed by ingesting cyanide or something. So like, whatever, fine. This plot was ridiculous from the very beginning, so I don't know why we should even. And so the United States comes in at the very end, just as Russia leaves the war. How convenient. Like just, you know, the United States couldn't come in like at 1915 or whatever. No, they had to come in just as Russia is leaving the war, and just in time to save France and Britain outside of Paris from the devastating German attacks that were enabled by Russia leaving the war. Like, it's completely set up. And from then on, of course, it's just the advance of the Western Alliance against the Kaiser. Now, to make it a little more exciting, sort of the wrap-up ending, when sort of the climax, or I think sort of the second climax. There are really two climaxes. One was the first battle of the Somme, and the second was the offensives of 1918. Those were the scary times when it looks like the Germans were about to win, right? So they did that, but they did basically the same time, and it was resolved in the same way both times. Basically, the first time the British came in as the cavalry to save the day at the last minute, and toward the end of the series, the Americans came in to save the day at the last minute. So just recycled plot devices here. So to make the wrap up a little bit more exciting, the writers, they introduced tanks. Like, sort of like, oh, this is cool, right? Tanks or whatever. Because tanks are cool. They're not like tanks how a smart person would make them, you know, with a turret on top, but they're done in a pre-dreadnought way, like on tracks with little sponsons on the side here. Or the French version, it's like a little gun in the front. And even I think they were gonna put in German tanks or whatever, but I think the series ended before that, or maybe the show ran out of budget or whatever. But none of the tanks were smart. The thing is, the British and the French and the Germans, according to this series, they all knew how to make turrets, because they used turrets on their battleships and cruisers and destroyers at sea all the time. And what's great about a turret? 360 degrees field of fire, no blind spots. You don't have to put two guns to cover, you know, two sides of the vehicle. You can put one gun on top and it has 360 degrees. And you could put a bigger gun up there, right? Because you don't have to have the weight of two guns. So you can put one gun and make it bigger and better. But no, somehow, when going from the sea to the land, when making an armored land vehicle, they suddenly lost the arcane knowledge of the turret. I mean, look, frankly, the writers, they just wanted to make something that looked really janky and, again, steampunky. I know I'm overusing that term, fine. My lack of vocabulary and how to describe this. And so, yeah, this is just aesthetics, I get it. And it's toward the end of the season anyway, so it's not too critical. And now, in reality, these things would be so ridiculously slow and ineffective, and they'd be really vulnerable to artillery. But I guess the writers, they just thought they looked cool, you know, kind of like the guerrilla walkers in The Last Jedi or whatever. And that's really how it ends. Just sort of a series of battles, and eventually the Germans surrender because out of nowhere the United States entered the war just as it looked like the Germans were going to win. So that's my take on the Great War, later retconned as the First World War. I'm not gonna lie, there were some interesting moments, but the writing is just so sloppy, and the plot devices and conveniences were so obvious, and like these alternative history weeaboo countries like Austria-Hungary or the Ottoman Empire They really kind of jumped the shark with the cartoon country Italy. It's me, Italy. But it was kind of funny to see, you know, how they portrayed the Italians, whatever the Italy people are, right, as being like the sort of the fawns stereotype who are totally incompetent at fighting while being in the territory of Rome. I don't know why I was trying to use the correct plural form of a fictional country anyway. And of course, the magical ruler Bismarck, who made Germany by winning a few skirmishes, and then all of the German states just rallied to Prussia, which is right next to Russia, by the way. They just rallied to Prussia to form Germany. Because why? Well, we got to get World War I going. We got to get this World War going quick. So quick, let's form the character Germany, who then immediately gets fired by Clown Kaiser Wilhelm because, for whatever reason, they wanted the German ruler to be an idiot, right? So, bye-bye Bismarck, hello Clown Kaiser. Now, if you just want a popcorn action flick, World War I might be okay if you just sort of turn your brain off. But if you're a critical thinker, the plot devices and conveniences and just the stupid decisions of the leaders that seem to be for the sole purpose to drag their countries into a giant, horrible war over some, you know, the Duke of Sarajevo or whatever. It's just so brazen and unrealistic. It pulls you out of it. It breaks immersion. And for me, it was really hard to enjoy because of that. The Red Baron, 3 wings! Here's my combustible airship, right? Here's my bomber. Oh, you discovered my weakness, that it explodes with a single bullet. That it explodes with a single bullet to the part of the ship that constitutes 80% of the volume of the ship. Oh, the British Expeditionary Force arrives at the last minute and saves the day. Oh, the United States enters the war at the last minute and saves the day. The plot is just so bad. I give the story a 2 out of 10. Really bad. The action and aesthetics, I'd give it a 6 out of 10. It's pretty good until they start bringing in like 3-wing airplanes and blimp bombers and tanks that forgot what turrets are. But if you don't care about that and you don't care about the kind of goofy comic book storyline and all the conveniences to start this ridiculous war, it can be a decent popcorn flick. Anyway, for those of you who watched to this point in the video, thanks for watching. That's just my review of The Great War, or World War I.